Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our next episode of Real Talk with the Illinois Science Teachers Association. Today, we've got a special kind of feature. Last episode, we talked about the new Africa storyline that Jason and his team have been working on, and we've been getting a lot of questions about it. So, we kind of want to share both what is a storyline, what does that look like, and more importantly, how do you work with real, authentic data in the science classroom. We're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Jean Dubach, and I'm going to turn things over to Jason to kind of walk through what is the storyline and let him talk to you a little bit more about the work that she's done and how we've been able to embed this, or how they've been able to embed this in their science storyline.
Thanks, Dina. So Dr. Dubach and I met through me volunteering because she put out a invitation, and me not being able to say no, I took her up on that. And when was that, Jean? Was that?
That was
long time ago.
2006 or something.
Yeah, somewhat way back then. And the stories that she tells with her data are just so intriguing that we talked about putting together a curriculum that would use this data that comes out of her lab to incorporate it into stories that we would use in the classroom. And so we started doing that, and we now have a set of data-driven activities that are available at xy-zoo.com. And those, some of which have now been incorporated into the Africa storyline unit that we've been working on over the past year. That we're now piloting as of 4 days ago. The first day of school, we went right into it, and the kids have been really productive and engaged with this. So I'm going to walk through that, and then we'll talk to Dr. Dubach a bit about why these things are so important. And since Dr. Dubach is such a supporter of ISTA and science teachers everywhere, including earning an award for her collaboration with educators through the National Science Teachers Association. She gave us data that she's published to incorporate into this Africa storyline that hasn't been in classrooms before. So we're pretty lucky to have such a great resource on our site. So I'm going to walk through week by week. We're not going to go in depth. Obviously, this would take forever to do. We're just going to give some highlights so you can see how we build coherence throughout this unit. So this unit is about 9 weeks, and we have color-coded the practices, the NGSS performance expectations, and the cross-cutting concepts throughout. This is a work in progress. This is a pilot, but we thought it would be nice for people to see what we've done, the work we've done, in the NGSS Biology Storylining Working Group. Now, if you didn't watch or hear us talk about this working group in the last episode, this working group was started by me through my work with ISTA. We gathered a few districts, 5 initially, to just sit and talk about what we could do as far as putting these integrated units together. And then that quickly grew, and now we've got over 50 districts who are following this work, and many of which who are putting forth, putting their hands into this work and creating things and offering things. So we've got week 1. We start by showing students the Battle at Kruger video, which, if you haven't seen it before, just Google that on YouTube, and you will see lions hunting water buffalo and the water buffalo fighting back. It shows both species in groups, and the idea is to get them, to get students asking questions about why some species live in groups. That addresses LS 2-8 in the NGSS, why social behavior is beneficial. We then have them watch it again day 2, but this time they're looking for specific observations as far as physical and behavioral adaptations. After they've listed these things, critically looking at their work as to whether they wrote down true observations or some inferences. Day three and four is they're using math to calculate metabolic rates, basically. How much energy does it take to take down different prey? And it drives them to the idea of, I need to hunt in a pack, or my cost is just too high. So students have been engaged in the productive struggle, I call it, when it comes to this math, and they're all getting it, which is a beautiful thing to see through that struggle. And then we're going to move into why else would you live in a pride? And that brings us to Lulu the lioness, and this was a story through information and data that Dr. Dubach had in her lab. And we created this activity that brings us to week 2. And the basic premise is that Lulu the lioness took 4 cubs to a neighboring pride when her pride was taken over. And through looking at alleles, the students first think is that she's the mom, but the genetics tells us a different story. So they're pretty surprised by that. We then talk about what lions possess, what characteristics they possess that make them alive, and we will revisit that list as we progress through this unit because their ideas will change. Then we move into more lion genetics activities where students will look at different populations, and they will be able to determine whether or not they belong to one population over the other, for example. Then we move them into using actual sequence to build a phylogenetic tree using cytochrome B sequence data. So it's all authentic, all real data. And then they do some research on where their pride is from. And so basically, what type of prey are there? What's the plant diversity like? What is the climate like there? Things like that. Ultimately, they will design a food web based on that information, and then they will visit the other prides to see what the similarities and differences are between their pride and the other prides across Africa. So that's where the field data for it comes in. We then move in, and the idea is, what type of food is available, and what's the diversity like. In day 2 of week 3, we start the hide and go seek-a lab, which is having students compare different digestive systems and really looking for patterns between these. If they know a lion is a carnivore and something else has a similar digestive system, what does that tell them? That sort of thing. Then we look into how energy is used in organisms, how lions obtain energy from food, and how elephants do. And then we move into a 3-day animal nutrition lab, which uses different data sets. We revisit the idea of the digestive system, but we also look at the teeth, dentition. We look at resting metabolic rates. They ultimately will design a diet, and then they will do a 3-dimensional assessment that will look at applying what they did to a new context. Then we move into the macromolecules, since we just talked about what these animals' needs are as far as proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Then we move into how lions use those differently than elephants, and students will actually break down a protein and then reassemble them into a lion muscle protein. So they'll break down a protein that a lion consumed, and then reassemble it into a protein that a lion actually needs. So a muscle protein, a collagen protein, things like that. And then they will move into building food pyramids and food chains using activities that were adapted from HHMI's website, biointeractive.org. And they'll build African food webs using the cards that they have available there. They'll move into carrying capacity of populations, why predators and prey populations look the way they do. And then we start moving into elephants. So the relationship between elephants and lions. And then we use the phenomenon of tusklessness and how how humans have impacted the allele frequencies in these elephant populations, and why tusklessness has gone up because of the selective pressure of human poaching. So we do those things. HHMI also has something called CSI Wildlife, where students will use simulated gel electrophoresis to determine where poached ivory came from. Then they have to assess the values that how different people value elephants. Obviously, the poachers they're valuing them economically, but do elephants have different values? They will look at 4 conservation programs that help conserve elephants, and they will evaluate according to either LS 2-6 or 7, but they'll evaluate a solution to a human impact problem, and they'll determine which one is the most beneficial to elephant populations. Then we move into the elephant census activity, which also includes an activity on survey methods, and we simulate this using lentils on a map, and students are basically doing more or less transect sampling to simulate how they count elephants in the wild. We move on to week 7, and we start talking about poop, and poop is the phenomenon that's going to connect elephants to plants. And we have created a simulated poop lab where we create this poop from peat moss, paper mache, and some timothy hay. And we mix in radish seeds, and some students will extract those seeds from the poop, and then they will sprout them in petri dishes. And they will do the same with other types of seeds that are extracted and sifted from dirt to show that elephants are shaping the landscape by dispersing these seeds in their stool, in their feces. While they're waiting over the course of that week for their seeds to sprout, they will look at data points that HHMI has put out that involve niche partitioning and why certain animals eat certain things. They'll do a mitosis lab that will compare the growing root tips of their seeds during the course of their experiment, and compare that to adult leaves to see what the difference is, so they can determine that there is a greater rate of mitosis in this growing root tip over an adult leaf. And then on that Friday, they will collect their data, both qualitative and quantitative data, on those seeds to see what happened. And ultimately, they will see that some are green and some are yellow, and that there's that chlorophyll obviously plays a role. When we move on to week 8, we're asking once again, are the characteristics are seeds alive? Do they have the characteristics of life? And we're asking that both before they do the experiment and now after. They will look at different savanna plants that Jeff Grant, who is at Downers Grove North High School, has used his artistic abilities and drawn them so that they can see that plants have adapted different ways to maximize their photosynthetic activity. We'll move into how plants get their raw materials so that they can produce new cells and grow. And we'll look at how different data, how different input will impact that rate of photosynthesis. And then we'll look at how that fits into the larger scheme, once again, the trophic levels and energy calculations. And then ultimately, we move into how cell respiration plays a role in this. And then that final week, they'll do some modeling as far as where lions, elephants, and plants fit in this big scheme of things. So you can kind of get an idea of the flow, and more or less get an idea of the different types of data that students will be using and analyzing in order to make sense of how the real world works. You'll notice this isn't a DNA unit. This is a completely integrated unit that uses all four of the big ideas. There's an ecology piece, an evolution piece, a genetics piece, and then cells and molecules. So thanks to scientists like Dr. Dubach, who let us use their data, we have this really rich experience for kids, and they know that they're doing something real. So I want to pull in Jean here, and one of the things that we that has always been at the forefront of her and my collaboration has been using authentic data. And she is one of those scientists who's just enthusiastic about, students seeing her data, seeing students using real world data to make sense of things. So Jean, why do you think as a scientist that's important?
Well, I've spent so many years sitting at my computer at night, and I'm the only one in the lab, and I've discovered something new, like data that says this is a new species, or this lion isn't the mother of all these kids that she just rescued. And it's so exciting, and I just think, wouldn't students like to know this kind of stuff? And why would you want to sit and read a book on Drosophila when you could be looking at lions running around Africa? I mean, not that Drosophila didn't contribute a lot to our knowledge, but there's more exciting stuff to learn and to get your curiosity and interest going. And so I just thought, why am I the only one that gets to enjoy all this wonderful data? And so I hunted around until Jason came and said, yeah, I'd like to do that with you. And off we went. And I think it's more real. It's real. Why wouldn't a student want to learn something real? And, everybody loves lions and elephants. Why wouldn't you want to know about that? And the thing that's so cool about all this, and this is to Jason's credit, is that it goes to a full three-dimensional, multidisciplinary approach to lions and elephants. And that's so cool. I want to do the exercises.
So you said that, what kid wouldn't want to learn? Student engagement is obviously rougher now than it ever has been because we have to compete with the digital world. Cell phones, and they're plugged in all the time. So, having these phenomena that are animal driven seem to be, even if kids are disconnected to nature, at least they want to know more, especially because these animals surprise us all the time, right, Jean?
Well, they do. You find out. One of the things I learned with observation data from these lions is that what you see isn't what's really going on. And you don't know that until you look at the genetics. And so you get a much deeper understanding of their social structure and their breeding structure and dispersal, who's gone where and where they came from. And we can look back a year or we can look back a million years with the DNA data. And so you can learn a lot from that you don't get with just observations, even though that's kind of fun too.
And so, and that gets to the next point I wanted to bring up, real world problem solving. So when why is it important for kids to tackle these real world problems in your opinion?
Well, because they, first of all, learn how to solve problems that haven't been in front of them prior to this. They learn how to sift through data. They learn how to do research, which is exactly what we have to do. And sometimes you want to curse at your computer and throw it away, but like I just did today. But you keep going and you find someone that can help you with it. It's always learning.
Yep. And that's just it, learning. It increases, their brain grows from doing this type of work. And that real world problem solving in any, whether they're a scientist or not, just makes them a good citizen. We have a whole society that's largely scientifically illiterate. We see it all the time. So, having them engage in these real world problems, even if it's halfway around the world, gives them an idea of how to use data and make sense of the world instead of, using using candy to count alleles or something like that. I'm not not that that's not a bad, not that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it gives them a real world perspective.
I think it isn't as exciting as looking at a real animal and figuring it out. And it probably gets them engaged and interested without them being aware of it, which is kind of a backdoor way of doing science.
Well, Dina and I will tell you, you need to trick kids into learning these days. So if we can give them a phenomenon that is engaging enough to gauge their interest and start asking questions, we're all for it. Why the last point I wanted to ask you about was integrating different areas of science together. Historically, as you know, we've taught broken, fragmented units. You know, we teach a DNA unit, we give a test, a genetics unit, we give a test, an evolution unit, we give a test. Why is this approach, in your opinion, as someone that's a scientist, why is that so important?
Well, because scientists are now beginning to learn that you don't just look at something in a straight little channel. It's not one-dimensional. An animal and every living thing is multidimensional. And you have to understand all of the aspects of it to understand why it is what it is. I mean, look at what we're learning about the gut microbiome. It's in charge of everything, and we just dismiss it. And so the more holistic you can look at an animal and a research problem. And this all boils down to conservation issues, what's going on climatologically, environmentally, ecologically, affects that animal and everything inside that animal. And so you can't just look at one dimension anymore, because we need to put all that together to conserve these species.
Yep. And I started with that Battle at Kruger video on Monday, the first day of school, and I asked the students, if I say those lions are female, is that an observation or an inference? And they said, that's an observation. I said, okay, good. If I say all those females are related, is that an observation or an inference? And they said, well, that's an inference. And I said, well, why? And they're like, well, we don't have the data on that. And I said, well, what would you need? And they said, the DNA. I'm like, good. You're going to do that Friday.
Good.
They're going to be, they're going to be looking at this stuff, but they're thinking, yes. And I want the kids to ask me for the data they need to answer the question. I want them asking. They're in charge of their learning. And I'm not standing up in front of the room spoon feeding them, telling them, you need to do this first, and then you need to do this second, and you need to do this third. They don't learn from that. They need to drive that learning.
And that's what I think is so special about this, because you get them questioning something and then they have to figure out how to answer it. And that really does get them engaged. And if you can connect with something that's really special, like a lion or an elephant, it gets them going, it gets them excited.
Right.
And they know DNA, they know the words.
Yes, and it's not important that they know it's a double helix. It's important that they know this data is how we answer questions. We use this to answer questions. And if they've ever watched the Maury show, they should know that by now, right? Who's the daddy? Every day it's who's the daddy. Not that I watched that show. Even today, when they were looking at students who were working in groups, and they each got 15,000, I call it K-Cal cash, kilocalories, but they look like Monopoly money. And we have lions on them. Female gets the 1,000, male gets the 500, because we know the females are doing all the work. But the kids say, well, I can't hunt a zebra because it needs 55,000 kilocalories. And I said, well, don't you have that? And they're like, well, I don't myself. And I'm like, well, does your pride? And they're like, well, we have 60. And I'm like, I'll talk to you when you have it figured out. And I just walk away. And then they all get to the idea of, oh, well, we can pull all of our energy together and work together to do this. And I often will ask them, like, why do you prefer group work? Because they get to share, right? They get to share the work. That's not uncommon in the animal world, right? Reduce your cost, increase your benefit. So they had a great time with that, but it was all student driven. So
very special.
It's thanks to scientists like you who are willing to share. So we so appreciate you not only sharing all of this amazing work, but sharing your expertise today. So thank you for being here. Dr. Jean Dubach is at the wildlife. She runs the wildlife genetics laboratory over at Loyola Medical Center. Sounds mouthful, sorry. And our collective work for teachers that are watching this is once again at xy-zoo.com. If you want information on the working group and you want access to the Google Drive that I showed you today, just shoot me an email at jason@drgreen.com. Be happy to share that link. Like I said, we have teachers not only all over the state, but all over the country now who are accessing this work to see it unfold, see us pilot it, see us test these things, see us edit things as students find, different quirks and things to, to challenge us on. But it's been a fun and a really valuable experience for not only the kids, but for me as a teacher.
And me too.
Yes, we appreciate that, Jean. So, Dean, is there anything you want to add?
No, the only thing that I can thank you so much again for taking some time to talk to us today about the importance of, I think, scientists working hand in hand with science teachers. And on that note, Jason mentioned we have teachers all over working on piloting these, but also working on other storylines in other grade levels and other content areas. If you are a scientist that has some really cool data and want to work with a science teacher on doing some sort of curriculum or storyline unit like this, shoot us an email, get us that information, and we will see if we can't connect you with some other teachers that are doing some of this great work, because our kids need they need that experience. They need to understand what's going on in the world around them. They need to get excited about science. That's, I think, the big piece that's been missing, and we're happy to help make those connections and network.
So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.